So today on the Art of Adjusting, we'll be talking about cannabis claims. I'm Chantal Roberts, and I'm joined by Norm Ives, a broker and cannabis leader of Worldwide Facilities. Norm, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Chantal. Appreciate the opportunity to catch up with you again and kind of talk all things cannabis and insurance.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, of course, I can talk insurance all day long, it's something that I can do. Now, full disclosure for our viewers, which I mean is absolutely zero. Like my mom doesn't even watch this, so I mean, for what it's worth. We know each other from other cannabis industry events as we've attended and have spoken at the same seminars and webinars. So I'm going to set you up with some hard-hitting questions right from the very get-go. First, I personally have a big issue with the use of the word, quote, cannabis for, quote, marijuana. And it's because I think that it creates a little confusion when it comes to insurance coverage. So can you tell us what is cannabis?
All right, there's actually a lot to unpack in there. I'll try to condense it a little bit. When we're talking about cannabis, we're talking about plants from the Cannabaceae family, of which there's 180 plus, maybe 200 plus varieties of this flowering plant. It's been known as, probably not a surprise to you or anybody else out there, cannabis, marijuana, hemp, whatever word you want to personally use. The genus of that plant has been around for 4,000 plus years, and it's been used by humans for medicinal treatments and applications throughout the course of time. So, so within the word cannabis, what's happening right now within the cannabis industry, and as you talk about things on a larger social justice kind of platform, that's part of where the regulated marijuana industry, the regulated cannabis industry is trying to be socially conscious and aware of the fact that the term marijuana was used divisively to label undesirable folks within the community that they were trying to marginalize through a series of laws, regulations, and political movements. And so there's a little bit of history tied to the word marijuana, which sometimes complicates things. And so there's a lot that goes into that. I guess the way I try to explain it to folks is marijuana and hemp are both considered cannabis. They're both part of the cannabis plant.
Right.
And if we're trying to have a conversation around insurance or even around agriculture, I encourage people to use a little different terminology. We have Farm Bill hemp, 2018 Farm Bill hemp, which is more the traditional agricultural crop of hemp that's grown for fiber stock. Now they're also growing it for CBD and some other medicinal values. But traditional, what 2018 Farm Bill hemp is cannabis sativa L with less than 0.3% THC. As long as you're less than 0.3% of THC, you're considered hemp, and you're not subject to the Controlled Substances Act as of the Farm Bill in 2018. Then the other side of it, what we traditionally would call marijuana, we have regulated cannabis or regulated marijuana. These are state organized programs, whether they be recreational marijuana as it started out in California in 1996, or whether we're talking about the 2012 version of Colorado and Washington legalizing adult use or recreational marijuana. So when people call me on the phone, I get calls all day long, and they say, "Hey, Norm, I got a great cannabis risk I'd love to talk to you about." The first thing I do is I have to put the brakes on and say, okay, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about regulated marijuana, or are we talking about Farm Bill hemp? Because they're going to be handled differently.
And that's exactly, I think, my issue coming from a claim side of things, because these words and definitions really impact coverage. And I am afraid that insurers are, bandying about this word cannabis when they mean marijuana, and they could be excluding hemp, or they could be covering marijuana and not meaning to do either one of those. And that kind of leads up to my lead up question, or my follow up question, I suppose, is how do these words and definitions impact coverage?
Oh, they absolutely can impact coverage. And I mean, to your point, coverage can be impacted in a number of different ways, depending on whether we're dealing with regulated cannabis or we're dealing with farm bill hemp. In most of the policy forms, let's stick primarily for the course of this conversation to casualty policies and liabilities opposed to property. So we're talking about damage or injury to somebody else. Somebody ingests your product, they got sick off a product you produce, you expect your insurance company to protect you. That's going to be a casualty or liability claim. And so most of the liability policies, actually every liability policy that I'm aware of in the insuring agreement, where they lay out all the legalese in the very beginning of the agreement, first and foremost, the thing that's going to trip a lot of people up, whether it be hemp or whether it be regulated cannabis, the thing that's going to trip people up is there's an illegal activities clause in there.
Right.
And regulated marijuana product with more than 0.3% THC is still illegal under federal law, under the Controlled Substances Act. And by virtue of that illegal activity notation in that insuring agreement, there is coverage removed. So most of the carriers, I mean, unless they've specifically gone back and modified their policy form for cannabis, the way they deal with that is through endorsement. They put an endorsement on the back of the policy that says, as long as you are holding a license to produce farm bill hemp and it contains less than 0.3% THC, coverage is granted under the form of this policy, blah, 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 and lays it out. On the marijuana policies, they typically come back and they refer to cannabis, and they try to refer to it by, it's common, members of the Cannabicaea family, and they use very general legalese terms to say is not excluded under coverage or not considered illegal so long as you are operating licensed by your state regulatory authority, and so on and so forth. So there's a couple of different spots in the policies they can catch you, but by and large, I think the carriers do a pretty good job. I would have a hard time thinking that a carrier could sit in court and argue in front of a judge that this claim should not be valid because this guy is running an illegal business when he's holding a license from the state and I knowingly issued him a policy knowing that he was engaged in this business activity. If I deny that claim, am I now providing illusory coverage to somebody who I knew about on the front end?
And that goes to, and it's funny because after you, I actually am going to be speaking to what I call a bunch of baby attorneys. They're actually law students, but I call them baby attorneys down in Louisiana, since we were just talking about New Orleans off camera. But, I talk about the liability aspects and how the HO3 says, and that the underwriters are trying to provide some kind of coverage for those states that have medical marijuana, because it says as long as you have a prescription. And of course, I have to sit there and go, oh, you can't prescribe marijuana, but then it goes to, again, the language of it, because I'm going to get a little bit far left field and be facetious here, because if we're looking just at the word cannabinoid, I've seen cannabinoid mentioned, like we're not going to cover marijuana, THC, anything cannabinoid, natural or synthetic, yada, yada, yada. But if you start thinking about it, and again, I'm going to take it way, way off into left field to make a point. I work out of my home. My kitchen is in my home. I've got cinnamon, I've got cloves, I've got black pepper. So basically, if I make mulled wine during Christmas, and someone trips and falls in my workspace because of a Christmas party, should my insurer start excluding kitchens because that has cannabinoids in it? Yeah,
No, it's I, in my opinion, that's a bit of a stretch. I
of
mean,
course, of course it is. But
yes, there are cannabinoids that naturally occur in plants other than cannabis. The cannabis plant is chock full of cannabinoids. They're constantly identifying new cannabinoids. I mean, there are ones out there that the general public hasn't heard of. I mean, THC, Delta 9 THC, the stuff that we've been told since we were kids causes reefer madness and just say no.
I was
That's
going to say that. Oh my gosh, Nancy
yeah,
Reagan, just say no. Are we
exactly.
betraying our age?
That's around Delta 9 THC. But I mean, there's a Delta 8 THC, there's
Exactly.
CBD, there's cannabigerol, CBG, there's cannachromine, CBC. There's several different cannabinoids within the cannabis plant. But to your point, there's also cannabinoids in pepper, echinacea,
Right.
kava. There's a number of plants that will have some minor cannabinoids in them, but that doesn't make them excluded under the policy. The policy forms typically when they start talking about cannabinoids, when I've seen that in the policy forms in this space over the last several years, it's insurers intentionally trying to exclude cannabis. And so
Absolutely.
there was one carrier early on that was selling policies that was excluding products and completed operations. And they had this very all-inclusive cannabis exclusion. It said cannabis was excluded. It said cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, cannabis ruderalis. Cannabis ruderalis, that's Asian ditchweed. That's a small little cannabis plant that can't get you high and only doesn't even do you any good for fiber. And it called out CBD, CBG, said if it was manufactured or extracted or synthesized, that it was excluded from the policy language. And so typically the carriers that go to that extent of calling out specific cannabinoids that they're excluding and so forth, that it is very specific to derivatives of the cannabis plant or chemical formulations that are intended to mirror those, as opposed to being components of other products that are more common.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm just taking it all the way to left field just to,
Well, I mean, it's
show that we've really got to pay attention in the insurance industry.
it's a valid conversation, because if we segue just a little bit off of that
Yeah.
to if we talk about Delta 8 THC.
Mhm.
So that's something that you're starting to see in the news now. If you do some Google searches on it, you're seeing it's topical.
Yes.
Delta 8 THC is a little different than a lot of the rest of the cannabinoids we're used to talking about.
Right. I did an
THC,
article about it.
exactly. THC and CBD are the most common cannabinoids that you're going to find in the cannabis plant. They occur at very high percentages. When you start getting to some of the CBNs and CBGs and Delta 8 THC, those are much smaller percentages. I mean, you're talking about CBN at 1% or less in even the most aggressive strains that they have to breed for.
Right.
And so Delta 8 THC can't be extracted from the plant because it doesn't come from the plant.
Hmm.
But Delta 8 can be made by converting CBD, of which there's a lot of in the market right now, into Delta 8. And it's a hallucinogen. It's not really high on the FDA's like list. They haven't
No.
specifically banned it yet. They
Right.
haven't made a final determination, but their preliminary rulings are painting a very clear picture that Delta 8 is probably not going to be with us too much longer.
Yeah.
But my point is that is a synthesized cannabinoid. That's a
Exactly.
cannabinoid that started out as CBD and we've transferred it. We've never seen it in the plant or in human consumption in high concentration, so they're not sure what it's going to do. That is a little different conversation to have with an insurance carrier about Delta 8
Yes.
than any of the other cannabinoids we might throw around.
I totally agree. So what are agents and underwriters who are getting into this space need to know? Because there are like 33 states plus Washington, D.C., which have some form of marijuana distribution. And a lot more states have CBD distribution and hemp. But as we just talked about, as long as it's under 0.3% is legal. So what do underwriters and agents need to know about?
Well, yeah, I mean, you need to understand the difference between the two. And you need to understand that, regulated hemp belongs in a regulated hemp policy, not hemp belongs in a hemp policy or maybe a traditional nutraceutical type policy, a health and wellness type policy, versus regulated marijuana. You're going to engage very specific carriers that are knowingly engaging in insuring regulated marijuana operations. I mean, there are not a ton of those carriers out there. If you're talking product liability, there's less than 10 carriers offering legitimate product liability in this space. And of those, only 3 or 4 of those are traditional carriers that you're familiar with. The rest of them are mostly MGAs, managing general agents, that are, getting reinsurance and borrowing someone's paper, maybe a little more tenuous of an underwriting situation. You've got all manners of insurance out there in the marketplace.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this because I was going to have to do some like water torture of you later because apparently one has to have top secret security clearance to figure out who actually underwrites marijuana and CBD. Now I know Golden Bear does, and I think
Yep.
Topa does.
Topa.
But I hear there's like 10 or 12, blah blah blah, and I'm not asking you to divulge your sources on camera. I'm going to get you later. We're going to go to like the water torture, underneath the
Waterboarding, yes.
yeah, waterboarding, exactly. Yeah, we're going to do that. So, but I mean, how many carriers? And you said about 10 or 12.
Yeah, I
are
mean,
in the space.
really relevant carriers in the marketplace. It really depends on what nature of coverage you're talking about. I mean, understand that most of the coverages in the cannabis space, they're going through wholesalers. And so you're going through the E&S and surplus lines market. Almost all the things that are out there, they're either going to be an MGA package, or it's going to more likely be an a la carte option where, okay, I've got my casualty carrier here. I might have to engage a different carrier for property. I'm definitely going to somebody else for work comp. I haven't even talked about commercial auto yet. What about D&O if I've got a lot of investors? And so you've got multiple pieces. There really is not a big BOP type program out there. Golden Bear, who you mentioned, they're an admitted carrier. They're admitted in California. It's the only admitted carrier I'm aware of anywhere in the country.
I know. And I think they're only California as far
only
as
California. I believe
Mhm.
there was a press release put out earlier this week. I believe they're gearing towards having an admitted product in Arizona as well coming up here in the next quarter or so. I believe I just saw that on a publication somewhere.
Good for them. Yay.
Yeah, I mean, outside of them, there's probably a dozen. The carriers get a little sensitive. They don't like us to necessarily mention them by name in this space, because it can upset their stockholders, or some members of the board are like, hey, look, we're going to do this, but we're going to try to not put it out front. We don't necessarily want to lead with the fact that, hey, we're America's biggest cannabis insurer conversations. But I mean, outside of Golden Bear, I know Admiral Insurance writes a lot in the cannabis space. That's an A14 carrier that's out there that's pretty relevant in the space and very actively advertising that they're placing cannabis risks. And there are several other carriers out there.
Awesome. Well, we'll do some waterboarding later. Norm, I know you're busy and I'm not going to keep you any longer. Is there something that you would like to plug before you go? Any speaking engagements or articles that you've written that are getting ready to be published, anything like that?
Nothing off the top of my head, really. I mean, it's I'm ready to get out of my basement here and get back out to events. We had I've been going to MJ BizCon for 6 consecutive years. I missed out last year. We all missed out last year. That was that was a bit of an adjustment. It's the time of year where we all get together and get to see, certain clients and vendors and folks. I mean, it's really is the one time of year where the whole industry gets together. And so I miss that gathering. I got a few speaking gigs here and there. Look for them online, search me out on LinkedIn. Search me out at Worldwide. Happy to talk to you. You're only as good as your wholesale broker in this space, and I'd love to help you with your cannabis needs. So
Absolutely. Norm, I appreciate you talking with us. Thank you. Today we've spoken with Norman Ives of Worldwide Insurance about cannabis selling and agency work and what the insured and even agents and underwriters need to know about cannabis claims. But every claim is different and every insurer has different protocols for handling losses. However, this being in the litigated world that we are in, see below for some legalese. Few claims go to a jury trial, and picking the expert who has been deposed the most or who's gone to trial the most may not be the correct expert. Failing to have a second set of eyes on the claim in order to save some expenses isn't always the best way to resolve a loss. As an expert witness and former claims adjuster, I'm sharing my experiences in the art of adjusting. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your time.